Welcome to the Binary Agora. I am your host, Alba Rivera Martinez, and on the channel we have explored different types of jurisdictions and approaches towards regulating digital markets and the dynamics taking place in digital ecosystems, as you will also see in the playlist above me right now. And during several episodes, we have reviewed, for instance, the approach that the Europeans, the Japanese, the Brazilians have introduced in order to capture market power with regards to big tech digital platforms. And on this episode in particular, we are going to add yet another jurisdiction to the mix, which is the United States, because a year ago, Representative Kat Hammack introduced the App Store Freedom Act in the U.S. House of Representatives, and last week, the U.S. Congress held a committee hearing on the same subject. And this new bill follows previous efforts from U.S. lawmakers in passing legislation that addresses some of the competitive problems arising in digital markets. And to discuss the App Store Freedom Act, I have with me Burrus. He is a competition law attorney focused on fair and open competition on digital markets. He spent 15 years at Microsoft, playing both on the offense and defense, and 3 years at Spotify as their global director of competition policy. And nowadays, he serves as the global policy counsel for the Coalition for App Fairness. So welcome to the Agora, Jean.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is ours. And so the App Store Freedom Act has been tabled and a hearing has been held already. So I would ask you, first of all, whether you can walk us through the main aspects of the Act, what its actual scope is, and how do you think that it differs from what we have already seen coming out from jurisdictions such as, for instance, the European Union or Brazil?
Yeah, so the App Store Freedom Act is very much like a bill that made a lot of progress in 2022, which was called the Open App Markets Act, which has been reintroduced in the U.S. Senate as well. And so we may yet see progress on that bill on the Senate side sometime during the rest of this year, too. I think you can trace the origin of both of those bills back to a bipartisan study and report on competition in the digital space that I think came out in 2021, I want to say. It might have been 22, but a bipartisan report that reached a lot of conclusions, which are very similar to the conclusions that other governments around the world have reached about the problems in the digital space with respect to dominant platforms. The App Store Freedom Act is focused similarly to the bill in Japan, focused just on the mobile space and the dominant platforms in the mobile space, which are iOS and Android. So it's similar to the Japanese approach in that regard, and it takes a similar approach to the DMA, where there's a set of requirements and prohibitions that are spelled out within the bill that address, I think, what we've seen as the abuses of these dominant platform players, and imposes those requirements on them to restore competition in the mobile space.
Within the US, as you have already mentioned, these types of bills have been subject to huge backlash, with the result that most of them have been dropped. Now, some of them are being rescued from the bucket. For instance, we know about the Open Up Markets Act, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, and the Ending Platform Monopolies Act. So do you believe that there is a greater chance that now the App Store Freedom Act gets finally adopted, or what is your opinion on that?
I remain hopeful. Of all of the approaches, I think the App Store Freedom Act and Open App Markets Act are the most likely to find their way into law in the United States for a couple of reasons. One, I think they address what I think are pretty now well universally recognized problems in a very discrete space. Unlike the Digital Markets Act, which really touches on almost every dominant digital platform, these are focused on, a very narrow set of problems in a very narrow set of platforms. And so I think for that reason, it's not scaring off as many lawmakers about the potential negative consequences or unintended consequences of what they might be doing. They kind of know what they're doing. And I would add to that, it takes an approach, I think, that has been proven to work. In a lot of respects, it tries to do to the mobile platforms what the DOJ consent decree did to the PC platform back in the early 2000s. and which worked well enough literally to give freedom to companies like Apple and Google to build massive businesses on PCs without interference by Microsoft. And so it's trying to achieve the same ends, I think, with a lot of the same approaches as that consent decree and then later orders by the European Commission and others around the world did successfully. So in that regard, it is less scary, I think, to lawmakers. I think the Open App Markets Act back in 2022 received a 20-2 favorable vote out of committee. So there is broad support. It's bipartisan. It's not just an issue that people are throwing out there to try to make points before an election. It's something that there's pretty broad agreement on. So that said, passing substantive laws in the United States is always extremely difficult. It's got a tough road ahead, but I think there's momentum in the House. The hearing was, well, there was no opposition expressed within the hearing to the bill by any member of the committee. We expect that there may be a hearing on the Open App Markets Act on the Senate side, and, then they can get together and reconcile those two bills and probably move forward. And so the bipartisan nature is unusual with almost any topic in the United States these days, but this one benefits from the fact that truly is bipartisan.
And building on what you were saying, because it seems, if I understood it correctly, that lawmakers are more prone to regulate or to impose obligations on app store markets as opposed to other digital markets more broadly. So I wanted to ask you about the scope of the App Store Freedom Act. So whether you think that this is just the start of a succession of bills or if this is the end road.
I think if it is passed and it works as I expect it would to kind of open up the mobile platforms to the same, the same freedoms that PC platforms were back in the early 2000s, I think it could be then seen perhaps as a proof of concept that would pave the way then for broader bills like the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, which much broader regulates a lot more of the digital platforms and therefore also draws a lot more opposition, right? That's part of the battle in the United States too, is the App Store Freedom Act and the Open App Markets Act. They really have only two sources of opposition these days, and it's Apple, Google, and people that are paid by Apple and Google to oppose it. So limiting the opposition helps get the bill through, and I would think that if this bill were to pass and work, and it would take a little while to prove that that's true, just as we've seen with other legislative approaches around the world in the last 5 years. But I wouldn't think it would be the end of the game because there are lots of other dominant platforms and their power over distribution and collecting data and other things are of vital importance to artificial intelligence competition. And so I would think it would be more a proof of concept that could be then expanded to, appropriately to other platforms.
And in this sense, before getting maybe into the nitty-gritty of the details of the act, I wanted to ask you, because there has always been this backlash from the US administration with Europe regulating their big tech companies.
Yes.
So I was wondering whether this is just grandstanding in the sense that, okay, US lawmakers are not opposing this type of law because they passed it, or is this a question of legitimacy, or is it a broader problem?
I think there's a couple of dynamics in play. I don't think it reflects serious policy differences between, say, the Digital Markets Act and what policymakers, even in the administration, want to see happen with digital platforms. But there is certainly a dynamic that plays out when headline fines get imposed on American companies. And it's characterized cynically, I think, that, that's just the European Union trying to solve their treasury problems on the backs of American companies. And so it's an easy thing for a U.S. administration to shoot at and make noise about. But I don't think when it comes to the conduct requirements that are in the DMA or other things that there is nearly the divergence that maybe the headlines make out. If the European Commission can figure out a way to enforce compliance without imposing fines, I don't know if you'd hear a peep out of the U.S. administration, who, they've appointed, even though it's a Republican administration, they've appointed antitrust enforcers that have far more in common with the last administration than I think, at least in my career, at least that we've ever seen when you change from Democrat to Republican, where you've seen historically, you see much greater swings in policy than you have from Biden to Trump or from Obama to Trump the first time. Policy-wise, I think there is less divergence than perhaps the noise that is made around fines in particular. And then I think there perhaps is just a sense of there are companies, there are children to spank, but you're not allowed to discipline them. We would rather discipline them ourselves. Now, how firm that discipline comes down remains to be seen. But I think there's a little bit of that going on, but it's that easy political thing that they jump on when the headline fines get announced, I think is the problem.
And in an op-ed on Washington Reporter, you also argue that Congress can cut the junk fee that applies to our phones when we interact with apps. And how do you arrive to that conclusion with the introduction and the adoption of this App Store Freedom Act? How does the act really ensure that result? And do you think that there are instances where malicious compliance can also apply to the act?
No doubt. To the latter question, I think no doubt. I mean, what we've seen out of these companies in response to new legislation like the Digital Markets Act or the DMCC or the Smartphone Act in Japan is that they will fight tooth and nail over every letter of the law and not engage in kind of good faith compliance first approaches to dealing with those laws. And to the point where last year at a workshop in Brussels, Apple literally declared to the European Commission, you are not the last word on what the DMA says, right? And that, to an American lawyer, that means we'll see you in court, right? That's kind of what it meant to me, and I'm sure it's what Apple meant too. So the European Commission is going to have to go to court in order to get things done. And I think I would expect not cheerful compliance in the United States either with respect to any law that might come along, especially when it might impact revenues. And both of these companies have used their market power on mobile devices to impose taxes, fees, whatever you want to call them, on the developer business community that don't reflect the value of the services they claim to be charging for, right? And so what the App Store Freedom Act does, what the Open App Markets Act does, is opens the door to making those markets competitive. If people want to choose different payment processors, or if people don't necessarily want to use the App Store, or if developers want to take a different approach or use a different provider of the various services, they will be allowed to do so. And so I think in that way, it's much like, I would say, the interoperability and access requirements that were imposed on Microsoft back in the early 2000s. And you can think about the impact of that. Microsoft, it's not because they weren't greedy enough that they didn't take a cut of every transaction that occurred over the internet on a PC. It's because of antitrust enforcement that stopped them from doing that. And so it opened the door to a company like Google, who made 95% of their advertising revenues over PC computers in the 2000s. Microsoft was not allowed to take a cut of that just because they were done on Windows computers. And the same thing with Apple, right? Their business took off when they introduced the iPod, but it's only when they were able to sell iPods not just to Mac users, but to users of PCs, because they could install iTunes for Windows on a PC without Microsoft either blocking it or demanding a share of their iPod revenue, that Apple was able to take off. And so I think it's the same thing with the mobile space, where, they built this essential platform. There's no way to do business anymore. And this is true of almost every business on the planet. Unless you have an app that loads on a mobile phone, your business is hamstrung. And so they own this essential platform, and they are extracting rents from the developer business side of it that they certainly did not when smartphones were first introduced back in 2008, 2009. It was not the case. And so eliminating their ability to tax that arbitrarily instead of just competing for services they want to provide to developers, I think, is the key here. And it is a tax that impacts like every consumer around the world that owns a smartphone, because whether you're subscribing to Spotify or Apple Music, or you're subscribing to a video streaming service, or you're subscribing to a newspaper online, all of those things carry this fee that is going to the platform owner really for nothing other than the fact that they own a dominant platform and can charge it.
If I understood it correctly, so you're referring to the 30% commission that Apple, for instance, and Google charges on all apps and in-app transactions. But the App Store Freedom Act, if I'm not wrong, it also goes beyond that, right? So it's not only about tying, but also about alternative apps distribution, for instance.
That's right. So it opens the door in a number of ways. Not just it eliminates the tying, but then it also eliminates, I mean, to some degree, you could say that the requirement of a single app store is a kind of a tie as well, but it opens the door to alternative means of distribution if you don't want or need Apple's distribution channel. I mean, Apple should be able to provide a distribution channel and charge for it if they want to, as long as you don't have to take it, right? And that's part of what's going on. It also guarantees equivalent interoperability for apps that find themselves competing directly with the gatekeepers apps. And then I think the last thing it does too is solves this problem of what is referred to as Sherlocking, where both of these companies, as a condition of putting your app on their devices, demands that you give them access to all of your proprietary data. And right now, there are no restrictions upon what uses they can put to that data. What the act does will make sure to say, like, yeah, you can look at the data, but you cannot use it in order to compete. And we've seen that happen time after time with different apps. We've seen it on the Amazon side of things too. But for these companies, they look at an app, they get their eye like, that's a good business, I'd like to have that business. And then they kind of are able to study that business simply because they own the platform, and then put the other guy out of business once they jump in. So, it addresses all of those things. Now, it's a pretty comprehensive bill in that regard of trying to kind of open up all of the doors to competition that are currently blocked. That said, I am confident that they will find new and creative ways to continue to block competition or deter it or try to tax it. You referenced kind of the malicious compliance thing too. I have no doubt the creative minds at Apple and Google will continue to try to find ways around the law and achieve the same ends through other means. It will be a combination, I think, of both courts and legislators, being agile enough to address those things going forward.
Let's assume that the App Store Freedom Act gets passed, and then alternative app distribution, side loading become the norm.
Yep.
And I'm assuming here the devil's advocate position, but many
Yep.
of the backlash here has also been, and with the DMA we have also seen it, that those opening those venues to competition also open the door to what they call unvetted apps to the phones and harmful content for the end user. So how do you respond to that? Is this a credible threat for security and safety, or is this just something that the gatekeepers are fabricating to try to hide behind this cloud of uncertainty?
I think it's definitely the latter. It's a scare tactic that they are using that I don't think ends up having a lot of reality. And I say that for at least a few reasons. I mean, first, it would make phones, when it comes to distributing services and apps from others, a lot more like, say, the Mac computer, right? And I don't think Apple would say for a second that the Mac computer is a terribly dangerous place to do your computing or work on a PC, right? And so there's a proven model that works, and Apple uses it, and it just happens to be one where they don't have market power, and so they don't need to have these toll booths put up like they do on the phone. The second piece of it is, it's already the case that most of the apps on your phone are unvetted, at least when it comes to those purposes. We see it every day with scams and problems within the apps. It turns out that Apple doesn't really use the app review process to scan for those sorts of things. And in fact, one of their executives in the Epic versus Apple litigation here in the United States was quoted as saying, when it comes to privacy and security, that it's like bringing a plastic knife to a gunfight is their review process. They internally don't think that they do a very good job, and why should they? They don't have any competitive incentive to take steps with this. I'll add to that, not only do they not have the competitive incentives to really do a good job at stopping it, they have a huge financial incentive to look the other way until it becomes a problem for them. Just in the last 2 weeks, the California Attorney General has brought a suit against both Apple and Google for having what are called these Nudify apps that are rampant across in their stores. When you make an in-app purchase in one of those apps, guess what? They get 30% of it. So they're quite happy to look the other way until maybe an attorney general raises the alarm about all of this stuff that's going on. So the financial incentives are twisted for them. And the last thing I'll add is there actually is a great potential by reintroducing competitive incentives into the app distribution market, that there will be solutions that serve customers and consumers' desires in this regard, and that will truly introduce app stores that are very carefully vetted for what apps are present there. Instead of a million apps, you could see an app store emerge that is like, this is the kids' app store, right? If you're a parent and you want to lock down your kid's phone and have an app store that you are confident just has apps that are appropriate for children, you'll be able to do that because suddenly that market need will be able to be addressed by independent facilities. And then I would add the fact that those apps could be addressed by independent developers means that Apple and Google will have to do a much better job in order to attract. I think it's a false premise that they're putting forward that suddenly your phone is in danger. Any consumer that believes that could simply stay with Apple. No one is stopping Apple from continuing to do whatever it is they're doing, and if people love it, they'll stay with it, right? But it's where they are falling short that the market can be filled in by people that have the ability to address those needs.
Moving forward to the institutional framework introduced by the App Store Freedom Act. So this is where, for us Europeans, is a bit more difficult to understand. So from what I read, both the FTC and the state AGs may play a role in making sure that the concerned digital players apply the provisions of the Act. So I was wondering whether this is the right approach, whether you think it is correct within the US legal regime to attribute these competences to the FTC, to the AGs. I guess that this enforcement framework only refers to public enforcement, so I wanted to also hear your thoughts on private enforcement. We were addressing at the start this combination of digital regulations that are coming live into everyone's devices. And I was wondering, how do you think that EU, Japanese regulators should coordinate to make sure that there is no malicious compliance? What we have seen in the past is that gatekeepers thrive when regulatory regimes fragment the market. So I was wondering, what do you think about that?
I agree with that statement. Obviously, there is a difficulty in, I would say, the formal coordination between various enforcers around the world. They all have different legal regimes and different statutes that they have to enforce, and it doesn't always conveniently come to the same outcome. But that said, it is the case that I would say competition law, and I think all of these pieces of legislation, while some people claim they aren't competition laws, they are all at least informed by, I would say competition law precedent and policy. They all take similar approaches as a result. You're right about the fragmentation, and that is an effective way to prevent competition from emerging for these gatekeepers, is if they can keep things fragmented. I think that is and was true in a lot of respects in the last big round of enforcement back in the early 2000s. And, you had first the U.S. consent decree, and then you had very similar but different in some ways approaches by the European Commission. And some of the things worked and some of the things didn't. Like you had Windows without media player, right? And I can tell you that sold about 16 boxes, and most of them ended up on the bookshelves either of Microsoft lawyers like me or European Commission lawyers that were on the enforcement team, and no consumer bought them. They were bought as souvenirs by the lawyers that were involved. And so that kind of fragmentation didn't work, right? Whatever the European Commission thought they would get from a Windows version without media player, it didn't happen. And fragmentation was a big part of that. But that said, they do talk and they do watch each other. And at some point, too, depending on the issue, it becomes almost an imperative by the company to try to get to a single solution around the world. There's a trade-off for them, too, right? Fragmentation, it may keep competition from emerging, but it also means that they might have to make 16 different versions of a product that they really only want to make one of. I think to some degree you'll see a convergence of approaches among the various enforcers just because they keep an eye on each other and talk to each other, and because at some point I think the companies will want to see it that way. There will be, I would say, a global settlement at some point, probably. It might take a little while to get there, but I think that might be where we end up.
And regarding the institutional framework with FTC and state AGs
Yes, first I'll comment. I think the lack of private enforcement, I think, is almost a nod to let's test this out before we kind of turn it out to anybody, to go enforce. There's a little bit of let's let the policymakers we trust enforce this first before we let plaintiffs' lawyers go make $1 billion off of enforcement. So that may be a walk before we run kind of nod, I think, a little bit. That said, I think in the antitrust laws, I think private enforcement is a huge need to both fill a resource space where public enforcement doesn't just have the resources to go after everything, but B, also can drive policy at times when maybe the public enforcers are unwilling to. But here we've got both federal and state level enforcement. That's a healthy dynamic, I think, that we've seen in other circumstances play out. I mean, if you look at the Google search case saga in the United States, right? You had back in 2012-ish, I think, the Federal Trade Commission was looking very hard at the Google search case and then ultimately decided to reach a pretty weak, agreement with Google that they wouldn't bring the case and Google would change a few of their things. The federal enforcers literally just decided to give up on the case. Then it was picked up later by the states in, 2018, 2019, and the states got together, 48 of them actually, to go look at this and eventually spurred the DOJ side of the federal enforcers to go after it too. It's a good dynamic because you always are going to have a set of bipartisan, state AGs that are motivated by very different things perhaps than a single administration at the federal level. It gives you the ability, if you knock on the Fed's door and they say no, you can go find other people that might be willing to hear your case.
Thank you so much, Jean, for sharing with us what the App Store Freedom Act is about, what the narrative also that holds it together is about, and also how do you anticipate that these economic players will in the end apply those provisions. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. For our audience, do not forget to subscribe, to like, to rate the video. Also drop a comment below if you'd like to make any question that you want on the App Store Freedom Act, and we will be happy to answer that. And thanks so much, Jean, for joining us here in the Agora.
No, thank you. I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.